Hare Krishna, dear devotees, my sincere pranams to anyone watching. Deva Madhavadas here, and I'm going to share in this presentation changes that can be made in order to ensure a healthy ISKCON today and tomorrow. At present, the society is in a kind of quiet crisis, and many people have silently quit, affiliated only in the most shallow ways, and many more have never even been able to dedicate themselves to Srila Prabhupada's mission in any way, not because they wouldn't want to, but because they're discouraged by the hypocritical state of the institution. So what I'm going to propose today is not a change in policy. It's not something that will depend on GBC or temple presidents or managers to allow or accept or administer. What I'm going to propose today and offer is a change in conception of the institution's role in the lives of healthy devotees. It's a change in conception that's fundamentally needed for present ISKCON members to move away from the toxic tendencies that we've allowed to become entrenched in our society. A change in conception is actually the most powerful change we can make, and that's evidenced by Krishna consciousness itself. The world is the same as it ever was. Reality didn't change when we took to bhakti, but our perception of it did. The same energy that used to torture us, we now connect with in a way that uplifts us, all because of a change in conception. So we don't need ISKCON to change. We need to change the way we relate to ISKCON. Many of us have been treading water in a kind of ocean of paternalism and nostalgia offered by well-meaning senior devotees who look to the good old days, and ultimately we're tempted and tricked by our own lazy tendencies to put the responsibility of our own lives in the hands of someone else. So ISKCON members for decades have been fooled into thinking that it's the institution's job to be Krishna conscious for us. We've been waiting for ISKCON to inspire us in our bhakti and to establish varnashram and to offer wholesome education to our children, even to protect our children, rather than being accountable to our own responsibility to these things, regardless of institutional conditions. So there's an organizational consultant named Peter Block, and he notes that oftentimes when groups recognize the need for change, there's this misguided sense that conditions will improve with new laws, or more oversight, stronger leadership. And these are ideas that we're familiar with in ISKCON circles, and it's definitely true that the GBC and other layers of formal management could and should be doing a much better job than they are. But Block would also point out that dwelling in that idea really just distracts individuals from taking the personal initiative required to make a favorable environment for themselves and those that they care for. So we've got to admit that collectively we've committed the classic religionist mistake of making the institution the deity. We've equated membership in ISKCON with Krishna consciousness, and this is a misconception that can create all kinds of disasters, many of which we've seen. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta warns about this tendency in his famous Putana essay. I'll share a quote. The idea of an organized church in an intelligible form indeed marks the close of the living spiritual movement. The great ecclesiastical establishments are the dikes and dams to retain the current that cannot be held by any such contrivances. They indeed indicate a desire on the part of the masses to exploit a spiritual movement for their own purpose. So this is why otherwise good people, good devotees, tolerate and even facilitate abuse of themselves and their peers and even their own children by the institution. It's not willful neglect, nor is it ignorance. It's the crippling idea that my Krishna consciousness is dependent on remaining a member of ISKCON, even at the cost of my own integrity and humanity. If you can't imagine leaving ISKCON, then you're not staying for the right reasons. As middling sadhakas ourselves, we tend to want salvation more than we want service. I want the institution to save me from my suffering, and I want them to only ask shallow loyalty in return. So I forfeit my free will to the mandate of managers, and I call that surrender, whatever the cost otherwise. And then my offering to Krishna becomes turning off my intelligence in the name of faith. Challenging even a dysfunctional ISKCON then means challenging my own identity as a devotee. Protecting my children means compromising my standing in Krishna consciousness. So the naked truth that's becoming clearer and clearer as more see the emperor's wearing no clothes is that we don't need the institution of ISKCON to be Krishna consciousness. And this is actually a really wonderful thing. In the early days of Srila Prabhupada's Western effort, ISKCON enjoyed this position of being the sole source of basically explicit Krishna consciousness outside of India. And when we hear of the nostalgic discussion of the old days, it's usually appreciation and a kind of longing again for this simple dynamic of literal dependence on the institution that underlies a lot of the sentiments. A lot of us have probably even thought, oh, if only we all lived in the temple, how much simpler life would be. And yeah, there's something to that. The first years of a child's life, even when they're more or less dependent on the parents, are a sweet and essential period. Mom and dad are meant to be like God in the life of the child. Yet there comes a time in that same relationship when both the parent and the child have to accept that mom and dad need to step aside and let the maturing individual make their own choices and decisions. In the same way, it's a sign of ISKCON's success. It's a sign of Srila Prabhupada's brilliance. It's a sign of his followers' surrender and sincerity that we find ourselves in a time where ISKCON both exists and yet is not the exclusive source of Krishna consciousness for people anymore. The rhino's been caught. The movement of Mahaprabhu is alive and growing in and outside of India. And so although this new era is actually a triumph for ISKCON, the fear and uncertainty that's been brought out by the changes in power dynamics over the years has generated inside all of us decades of awkward behavior. So dishonor feels worse than death, as Krishna warns us in the Gita, and we're all creatures of habit. So those devotees who held power for decades, they seem mostly intent on keeping it in spite of themselves. And the common people, increasingly aware of our own importance and the importance of our own independence, we all still remain apprehensive to meaningfully use those things. So the result is this institutional culture that in many ways is like an insipid, lethargic kind of parody of the ideals that we're meant to be supporting. And what's the alternative? So we have to recognize that the actual supportive function of the institution is to offer help and support to the already established ethos of the Gaudiya Vaishnava Parampara. ISKCON is meant to support Parampara, not supplant it. And ISKCON didn't establish the Parampara, but it can perpetuate it. So imagine the institutions like the bow and the Parampara is like the arrow. With a bow's help, an arrow becomes potent and effective, but without an arrow, a bow is just useless, while an arrow that's still sharp can do its work. So I'm going to take a metaphor from Prabhupada's own speech. Srila Prabhupada asked that his leaders, and particularly the GBC, gather in Mayapur each year to discuss unity and diversity. And if we take these two words together, we get the word university, which organizationally gives an empowering idea and also details of what a healthy, functioning institutional ISKCON can do to support the spiritual lives of the countless people it's supposed to. Devotees that are interested in a potent ISKCON should learn to conceive of and relate with it as a university. Universities are formal institutions dedicated to the growth and support of subtle principles and ideals, just like ISKCON is. And the university structure is wildly successful. It spans all cultures of the globe and has endured for centuries. Intriguingly, the first university was established in 1088 AD in Italy. Other people say that it was established in 859 in Morocco. Either way, we can only pray ISKCON would navigate the coming centuries with the same kind of resilience that universities have. A university's purpose is to educate, and again, this is something we know from Srila Prabhupada is literally the prime purpose of his ISKCON, being the first one that he listed when he incorporated in New York in 1966. So ISKCON has been wrongly thought of as judge and jury and administrator and executive of Mahaprabhu's mission for way too long, and we've all neglected ISKCON's natural position as an educational institution. A university has 5 core constituency groups, and looking at how they're dealt with will give us clarity on how this change in conception amongst lay members like us can in itself solve most of the awkward challenges facing ISKCON today. Not that challenges will ever actually go away, and that's another naivety that many of us have. Not even in Vraj is the kind of sickly version of utopia most conditioned souls conceive of existing. Krishna loves tension, and the natural tension found in a responsible spiritual community is wanted. It takes maturity that a lot of us don't have yet to accept and face that also. But a lot of the frustrations that we see at present are created by the awkward psychologies that we've been discussing, and the experience of them creates feelings of resentment and guilt rather than a sense of responsibility and gratitude. So students are the first group that you usually think of in regards to a university. And right now, ISKCON has too many and too few students all at once. Students are the most committed members of a university community, and that's because they sleep, eat, breathe all things institution. But the whole point of those students doing that is so that one day they'll leave, to one day not be dependent on the university and instead go out and prove themselves independently capable. Unfortunately, because of the overly nostalgic view of the early days of ISKCON, our whole society continues to think that the way a new Bhakta lives is the way we should all be willing to live forever. And any step away from that classic program is some kind of compromised position that might be tolerated, but it's definitely not considered ideal. So simply put, in 1972, it meant to be an ISKCON, you lived in the temple. And so in 2022, it means that you should want to live in the temple. And of course, this is rarely outright spoken these days, but it's implied. And this pernicious underlying misconception is shown by the decades of broken families and neglected children that we have. Via this thinking, an individual bhakta's family and partner is on a subtle level a kind of sign of their failure and that they're not real devotees, which breeds resentment towards their partner and their dependents and opens the door for all kinds of mistreatment. Maybe the height of all ironies is that because there's this undercurrent of resentment towards anyone not living in the temple, nobody wants to anymore. And many temples, particularly in the West, are just empty. Not that nobody would want to live in them, but they know that there will come a day when they don't want to live in a temple, and they'd rather forever be seen as fringy than to one day become fallen. So again, dishonor is worse than death. The students of ISKCON's university should be ISKCON's chief concern, but to really understand how we can take care of our students, we have to appreciate what others need also. Think of the most prestigious university you know. Maybe it's Oxford or IIT Madras or Harvard or Yale or whatever. But you think of that place, ironically, not because of the students, but because of the alumni. Great universities have great alumni, and this is the single biggest missing dynamic in ISKCON's social fabric. Alumni get to participate in all the victories and celebrations of the university, but no longer have to slog to class like 5 days a week and pay tuition and textbooks. Alumni volunteer heaps of money, and at elite schools even more than the students do. But the university doesn't have to take on all the headaches of maintaining their rooms and board and health and safety as they do with students. It's a best of both worlds for everyone, and most of you watching this video need to be thinking of yourselves as ISKCON alumni yesterday. As much as no professional in their field should ever again become an undergrad, you will and never again should be in ISKCON the way you were the first 5 or 10 years you joined. Yet so many feel like second-class citizens or sellouts for living what ought to be seen as a wildly successful alumni life after a natural early period of institutional involvement. So the fame and infamy that comes upon our Sangha is also deeply affected by this lack of an alumni ethic. Down the street from me is the University of Michigan, and it's one of the US's top schools. One of the founders of Google graduated from there. Famous athletes like Tom Brady graduated from there. And even US President Gerald Ford graduated from U of M. But maybe U of M's most famous alumni is one they never tell you about. And that's because he's the most famous domestic terrorist in US history, known as the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. This guy, who's technically brilliant, got his mathematics degree from a PhD from U of M, and he got his undergrad from Harvard, and he used all that smarts to build letter bombs that killed over 70 people in the US over 4 decades. If not for a family member finding him out, then the FBI may have never even caught him. Yet nobody thinks to put blame on this guy's behavior on the University of Michigan. They understand that U of M gave him the same quality education they gave everyone else, and it was his own poor choices that led to those deaths. So conversely, Google founder Larry Page only spent 60 years at the University of Michigan, and yet decades forward, nobody questions when the university uses his name and his image to promote their educational offering. And young people everywhere hope to attend the university as a step towards becoming the founder of the next big thing themselves. And it's not even that you have to be a billionaire to be a good alumni. The university has a whole office dedicated to helping alumni network with each other, provide each other resources, and encourage alumni to give back to the place that gave them so much by giving some money, giving some time. Successful people from all fields love to go back to their former schools, alma maters as they call them, and share with bright-eyed young folks messages of hope and encouragement about sticking it out and bearing the austerity of the cost of a university education for a few years, because it's an essential part of a meaningful life later on. But who tracks the number of murderers or rapists that graduate from university? Who knows how many felons that they themselves went to school with? It'd be naive to think that some students that we went to school with didn't end up criminals, yet none of us would ever think that it was our university's fault for those people turning to that kind of behavior. So alumni are this magical category of people who the university gets to take all credit for and none of the blame. Ironically, in the paternalistic atmosphere of present-day ISKCON, where the institution is micromanaging everybody and everybody's letting them, then the institution gets all the blame for bad actors and gets none of the credit that it deserves for giving so many of us devotional support. So this kind of possessiveness also stifles the natural creativity and initiative that Parampara actually thrives on. Imagine an alumni of their university asking if they're allowed to take a certain job somewhere, start a certain business, or even marry a certain person or have children. Yet how many worthy projects and preaching centers and relationships between guru and disciple have been smashed on the rocks of the kind of sycophantic deference that we offer to managers and authorities over the last decades? How many horrendous scenarios were allowed to go on in perpetuity just because they were given this kind of cloak of institutional approval or were convenient for cronies of one kind or another? So let your own answer to those questions kind of burn away any sentiments you have for remaining a student of ISKCON if your time has come to graduate and grow up. Most of us listening right now are in your alumni phase of ISKCON and your relationship to the institution, whether you like it or the institution likes it or not. And embracing our natural role and responsible, cooperative, but ultimately informal connection to the institution is the way to break the codependency that's developed over the years. Fewer of us who are listening are in the category of prospective students. And understanding this group helps us understand some of the biggest questions facing ISKCON in regards to preaching and outreach in the modern era especially. So a few senior leaders, recently I was listening to them discuss Wisdom of the Sages podcast, and one of them remarked, "We need our own wisdom of the sages." And when they said that, I understood that they didn't really get what the devotees who've created that platform, which is wildly successful, are doing and how important it is. Saying that is something like Harvard saying we need our own elementary school or high school. A university is designed to receive and nurture people who have reached a certain stage of maturity in their educational pursuits, and it depends on other groups and systems preparing those students for college-level work. So there was a time when ISKCON had to provide both the pre-K and the PhD program for everyone's bhakti project. But today that's not necessary, nor is it even appropriate or possible. Krishna warns not to do someone else's duty. And for too long, preachers have been allowing ISKCON to micromanage and move in on their service. And so the toddlers and the adolescents that those preachers should be carefully caring for are just prematurely held to like graduate level standards that leave so many of them crippled and discouraged. It takes so much nuance to handle new aspiring bhaktas, and even more so when they're from adharmic, socio-economic backgrounds. So ISKCON has an ocean of faithful, charismatic alumni who know what it would take to get people locally interested in ISKCON University. But those alumni have to learn to trust themselves in that service, and the institution has to stop intimating that they're just giving substandard experiences to everybody. What would it do to the reputation of Oxford if professors made a habit of going around to high schools and telling their children that their teachers are cheating them? So that senior leader should let wisdom of the sages be itself, and instead of trying to move in on their space, that leader should figure out how ISKCON can play its role when followers of that platform and other platforms like it are ready for the next phase in their bhakti education. One couple in our community has been organizing ecstatic dances at rented venues for a few years now. And this devotee, he composes his own electronic music and then DJs while people dance. I don't like electronic music, and I don't like dancing unless it's in a kirtan. But we have 3 people in our community now whose early connections were through these programs. And probably another 10 people have visited the temple at least once just because of dancing at these ecstatic dances first. That doesn't mean I'm going to go out and start organizing a rave Friday nights at the temple in place of Gaur Arti. It means I'm going to continue to celebrate this devotee and leveraging of things he and others like with spiritual truth. Leverage preaching is what we've undermined in ISKCON for decades with this insulting moniker of bridge preaching. We have to blow up the bridge and stop perpetuating this false dichotomy of Krishna being somewhere other than where people are in their life. Leverage preaching means helping people trust Krishna through their trust in you. Their trust in you comes from some social context. It's professional or familial or whatever. And in the case of my dance guy, it's their mutual love of techno. He gets techno, they get techno, but he gets Krishna, so then they get Krishna. How many of our alumni have had the wet blanket of 16 rounds and 4 regs thrown on their heartfelt desire to share some experience of God with other living entities in a down-to-earth way? We can't expect most bhakti bureaucrats to give these kind of metrics up as the sole measure of success because it's what keeps them in perceived power. But if individuals start taking account for their own inspiration and teach people what they know in a mood of communion through harmony with Krishna's energy, then eventually we'll overwhelm all these stiff institutional walls with hordes of sincere people, and the collective weight will collectively break their religious myopia. The more becoming a committed student in ISKCON looks like an eventual and natural spiritual step for an individual that takes it, the more the world will be able to recognize the value of what Gaudiya Bhakti is really offering. So now that we've got an idea of where ISKCON should be less involved, namely in the lives of prospective students and the lives of graduates, it's a little clearer where ISKCON should give most of its focus. Like every good university, ISKCON, the institution, should mostly learn to focus on giving a stellar education to its enrolled students. And even in the present atmosphere of dysfunction, a lot of committed students in ISKCON follow a natural university timeline. Nearly everyone is really into it for like 3 or 4 years, and that's like undergrad. Maybe they're grihastas already, maybe they live in a temple, whatever the case. They live and breathe ISKCON for those first few years. And some stick with it a few more years, that's like graduate school, and some a few more years, that's like getting your PhD. And a very few become professors and administrators. And these are our temple presidents, these are our official preachers, our head pujaris, our ministers, our GBCs. And a university must be really vigilant about these people being held to the highest standard. All the energy ISKCON spends at present micromanaging relationships it has no jurisdiction in, like husband and wife, guru and disciple, parent and child, etc., should instead be spent ensuring those people who represent the institution in a formal capacity are behaving responsibly. Does ISKCON have a clear curriculum for its students? Is it aware of its responsibility and the relatively short period of time that it has to fulfill that role? A lot of people have 3 or 4 years of deep attention before the rest of life will call them back. Are we teaching them how to think about life in a Krishna conscious way, or what to think to remain good members of the institution? The paradigm and pedagogy of ISKCON are intimately bound together. As awkward as it is that we still subtly think that all people should live in the temple, it's equally awkward to teach everyone as though they live in the temple. We're 2 decades into the 21st century and still ISKCON doesn't have an online Bhakti Basics course. Random good souls, including myself, have here and there tried to put something together, but why haven't our leaders pooled the dynamic human resources our society's aggregated over 50 years to produce something first class that the whole world could use? Imagine how useful it would be for local communities in this kind of modern globalist era to have all the basic practices needed to keep Krishna in your life presented in a really nice video course and punctuated by a rainbow of the charismatic and potent presenters from around the world who prove by their own presence that bhakti is for everyone. So I'm not contradicting myself here. There's a place for centralization. Students come from Harlem and Honolulu and Hong Kong and Hyderabad, but when they get to Harvard, they're all given the same Chemistry 101 book. And that period of life is precious for the students. All bhaktas deserve a relatively brief but memorable period of immersion and focus, and being told what to do and how to do and where to do and why to do, so that the rest of their life they don't need someone coddling them and controlling them. Many of you are probably like me concerned with the conditions of our temples and the standards there. Those temples are like our university campuses. And what are they saying about the condition of our university, our culture? Temples are intended to demonstrate a specific standard, and some of that is meant to stay in the student's life lifelong, and some of it is just meant for the temple space. And again, the irony of that is that temple standards is now the temples look like homes because people can't handle the artificial pressure and so degrade the culture at the temple to feel okay with their own natural existence everywhere else. Thus, the temples are usually in shabby condition, and the people who are familiar feel comfortable, and the people who are unfamiliar become disillusioned by the social and physical culture before their practice of bhakti can even begin. So ISKCON has for too long been worried about who isn't coming and who is gone, and as a result almost completely lost sight of how to support those people right in front of them that they're actually supposed to be caring for. At present, we squeeze every drop from a person we can for about 4 years and then complain about them being distant for the next 4 decades. If we understood that when a person comes to ISKCON, they first need a deep period of receiving and being nourished, a deep period of profound education, we should then, if we understood that when a person comes to ISKCON, they first need a deep period of receiving and being nourished, a deep period of education, we would soon have an army of healthy people to champion the institution for the next decades and centuries. How you start a war is not how you end it, and as urgent as ISKCON had to begin, that much patience we must now show if we want to be taken seriously even by our own people. So finally, we'll talk about the trustees, our acharyas. Srila Prabhupada gave his followers an impossible task of creating an ideal society inside and outside of ISKCON amidst this tumult of Kali Yuga. And he's taking his cue from our acharyas, all of whom shared this sense of possibility. And they're like our university trustees. They're who make sure the original intentions of the institution are being served. Universities are established to uplift humanity also through cultivating knowledge in different disciplines, arts, medicine, hard sciences, socioeconomics. And just like ISKCON, they run in dangerous territory if they ever think themselves the origins of those subjects they teach and develop. So we aren't giving up on Srila Prabhupada's mandates when we recognize ISKCON is primarily for the purpose of education. Actually, we make those mandates fully realizable by not expecting too much or too little from the institution in pursuit of them. It's not ISKCON's job to do any of the things Srila Prabhupada outlined in his books. Rather, it's to create people capable of doing them. So a university has a hospital, but it's focused on training doctors. A university has a lab, but it's focused on training scientists. So we don't need 1 or 10 ISKCON farms operating in an ideal way. We need 100,000 farmers with Krishna in their hearts and Prabhupada on their minds, working their own land, caring for cows, and showing others how to do the same. We don't need a handful of functional gurukuls scattered across the planet. We need thousands of communities alert to the kind of holistic needs of their children. It should not only be accepted but appreciated that most of those we train will leave and go make their contributions so-called outside of ISKCON. Going outside is a good thing when you carry with you the ethics and training gained through good education. So naturally there will be overlap, special partnerships between the university and private entities, alumni, etc., resources, responsibilities, all of that can be shared for mutual benefit. But most of the best of what's already happening in ISKCON at present is existing in a kind of tatashta zone, ISKCON adjacent orgs and efforts that take the subtle support of the institution but bear all the logistical headaches themselves. Srila Prabhupada even proved the importance of such separate endeavors by establishing the BBT and the MVT and others. So the impact of universities in a broad range of fields should let us know that this dynamic of informal affiliation with ISKCON is something to celebrate and encourage, not resent and try to snuff out. It should be obvious also what this framing can do for us in answering the question of how to relate to other sanghas and religions. Other groups are like other universities, and we should judge them based on their merit and appropriate standards. The University of Michigan, for example, has lots of rivals in sports, but in the lab and classroom, their people work together with those folks from the other universities to advance the causes of knowledge that they're working towards. I'd like to close by reaffirming that I'm here offering a conceptual framework. It's not a hard and fast set of rules or policy declarations. I hope it's clear that you don't need anyone to approve of you applying these distinctions aside from your own conscience. You can right now begin to relate with others through this lens and better understand what to expect of them and what to expect of yourself in the relationship. So I'll conclude with some encouraging words from our own Srila Prabhupada about his own vision for the institution's role. He was vehemently opposed to excessive bureaucracy, and he believed deeply in Bhaktivinoda Thakur's own brilliant vision of a decentralized global Gaudiya Sangha. 150 years before Uber made your car a taxi or Airbnb made your home a hotel, Bhaktivinoda Thakur radically declared that your house could be a temple for Krishna if you faithfully kept the Bhagavatam, the holy name, Krishna Prasad, and the Vaishnavas inside of it. He tuned into the ethic of modernity a century before capitalism could recognize it. An education of his liberal message is exactly why Prabhupada established ISKCON. So in one encouraging letter, Srila Prabhupada writes, with reference to the boys holding kirtans independently, our propaganda should be like that people may open different centers of their own, or each and every householder may have his own class at home. Not that everyone is required to join the society. They may take the idea from the society and introduce it in their private life. And in his famously heavy and clear-cut letter to Karandar Prabhu in 1972, Srila Prabhupada writes, do not centralize anything. Each temple must remain independent and self-sufficient. That was my plan from the very beginning. Why you are thinking otherwise. Once before you wanted to do something centralizing with your GBC meeting, and if I did not interfere, the whole thing would have been killed. Krishna consciousness movement is for training men to be independently thoughtful and competent in all types of departments of knowledge and action, not for making bureaucracy. Once there is bureaucracy, the whole thing will be spoiled. There must be always individual striving and work and responsibility, competitive spirit, not that one shall dominate and distribute benefits to the others, and they do nothing but beg from you, and you provide. No. So my deep thanks to anyone that has made it this far. The institution of ISKCON has so many wonderful individuals within it, and I aspire only to be a servant of all of your inspiration to serve Sri Guru and Gauranga. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Param Vijayate, Shri Krishna Sankirtanam. Hare Krishna.